I wanted to say a brief hello in person. Well, not exactly in person, but hello all the same to every one of you in our Summer English 205 Intro to Creative Writing class. Let's have an unsynchronized but rousing round of applause for Matt and for you as well for your comments and participation in the poetry unit. Congratulations on turning in your portfolios. Look forward to reading your work here on out. As you've seen, you'll be receiving an email from me at least one time a week, giving my impressions of your comments and exercises. And I'll also be carefully reading your two major projects for this half of the course, your first and final drafts of a wonderful, excellent, polished short story. I'll be contributing videos throughout as we move through term, each of which will give an overview of the elements of fiction like plot, conflict, character, voice, point of view, image, which you've already made a thorough study of in poetry, setting, metaphor, symbol, form. We'll also talk about theme, of course, particularly as we read the assigned stories. And we'll think about the elements of fiction as moving parts in the machinery of the story. Moving parts that, if a story is done well, seem to the reader largely invisible. Now, on to the first of the elements of fiction, plot. Plot, simply defined, is what happens in a story. If you've ever felt suspense while reading, wondering what's going to happen next, or how a character is going to respond to something that has just happened, then you have felt the pull of plot. Plot is developed through a complex coordination of language, characterization, and voice. An action or event may reveal a character's emotion, state of mind, or motivation. The event may also be of metaphorical significance. Exposition and dramatization are two components of plot. Exposition includes background, context, introduction, and summary. It tells rather than shows what happened. In Raymond Carver's classic short story, Cathedral, for example, much of the background information concerning the narrator's wife and Robert is relayed to the reader through exposition. When Robert arrives, the story shifts toward dramatization, also known as scene, which involves dialogue, description, action, and a greater sense of urgency. The plot of a story tends to strike a balance between exposition and dramatization, often using the former to contextualize and set up the latter. Exposition and flashbacks, memories or moments from past events, also help establish character motivation and show how the past has influenced the current dramatization. In Dorothy Allison's River of Names, flashbacks are used to show the contrast between the narrator's past and present lives. Foreshadowing is another device that can add depth to a story. Here, images, events, and dialogue are used to anticipate and suggest later events. An example of foreshadowing occurs in Gish Jen's Birthmates, when Art Wu, checking into a rough-looking hotel, sees a plaque that reads, "Fewest customer injuries, 1972 to 1973. His anxiety about what this plaque means foreshadows the injury he will soon sustain. A traditional plot progression is set into motion by establishing the story's conflict. This problem, or tension, often between characters, propels actions and reactions. The development of conflict and tension is called the complication, or rising action. When the story reaches the height of its tension, it arrives at its turning point, sometimes referred to as the climax. Here, something significant is decided or not decided, acted upon or not acted upon, and the results lead to the falling action, where the narrative winds towards its resolution, or denouement. Reginald McKnight's The Kind of Light That Shines on Texas is an example of a story that follows this traditional plotline, as is Cinderella, as seen in this graph. A conflict with the stepmother triggers the story. A rising series of complications follows. She's invited to the ball. Her stepmother says no. The prince falls in love with her. The clock strikes 12. You know the story. The slipper fits. They fall in love. And while in an old-fashioned story like this, they live happily ever after, These days, we usually look for a more ambivalent ending, a denouement more like life itself. While many stories over the centuries have followed this linear ABC progression, also known as Freytag's triangle or simply traditional plot, many contemporary stories lean deliberately away from this familiar arc and forego clear turning points. One example is Rick Moody's Boys, which builds upon the repeated line, "Boys enter the house," and becomes a kind of chant. Stories also usually contain a subplot, a minor secondary plot line that can be used to further conflicts or contrast or parallel the central plot. McKnight's use of the secondary character Marvin Pruitt, whom the narrator at first does not like, but who eventually comes to the narrator's defense, is just one example from our book 3030. One marker of some modern and contemporary stories is the moment of epiphany, in which a character reaches a realization or moment of insight. A term closely associated with the stories in James Joyce's modernist classic Dubliners, an epiphany or showing forth refers to a character's realization about something true, important, or meaningful about him or herself or his or her world. We can see a famous example again from Carver's Cathedral, when the isolated, friendless narrator experiences a moment of community and spirituality with the blind man. Alternately, a story might play with or challenge that idea of epiphany to generate a sense of uncertainty or displacement. Annie Proulx's Job History is an example. Consciously avoiding an encapsulated emotional summary, the story's protagonist remains detached, a part of the indifferent, hardscrabble Western environment that shaped him. A little more about conflict. Conflict is central to the development of character and plot. It builds tension, emotion, and drama, giving us a sense of what is at stake in a story. Most stories give us glimpses of both internal and external conflict. External conflict can occur between characters or between a character and an outward source. Internal conflict occurs within a character and might be shown through his or her self-doubt, insecurity, and fear. Characters might be grappling with their pasts, the decisions they have made, or their own sense of identity. Internal conflicts are usually expressed in some way through external conflicts. As we examine how a conflict works, we are really examining a story's ideas. Do the conflicts emerge from issues concerning values and ethics? Are they about desire? Is the conflict resolved? How or why not?